Hello, good evening. I'm Gerald Hewitson. I'm from North Wales Area Meeting, and I'm Clerk of Quaker Truth and Integrity Group.
Thank you.
I'm Jan Arriens from Southern Marches Area Meeting, which straddles the border with Wales. I live in Shropshire. And there's a nice sense of coming full circle for me, because I've been a friend for about 35 years, going to a meeting, or starting at a meeting in Cambridge in the mid-1980s, of which Gerald was a member. And we were probably about the youngest members of our meeting then, and we probably still are, Gerald.
I'm Martina Weitsch. I'm from York Area Meeting, and I'm also on the Quaker Truth and Integrity Group steering group, and look forward to the conversation.
Well, that's certainly what we like to hear. I think just a reminder to everybody, this is being recorded, but don't worry, you can't be seen or heard. It will just be people currently on the screen who will be seen and heard in that recording. But you can, of course, put any comments in the chat to talk to each other. And as we said before, put questions in the Q&A box, which we will keep checking all the way through. I think if there's nothing more to introduce, we will get started with a little bit of silence, friends. Thank you, friends. So, as Jill explained earlier, this edition is all about truth and integrity. So I guess we'd like to start with a question, probably aimed mostly at, if we start with Martina, and then maybe Gerald kind of popping in as well. Obviously, Jan, if you've got anything like that, please do. But how do you feel when you sense that you cannot trust those in power? Martina, if you'd like to maybe explore that first.
Yes, I think that's one of the really important questions in this context, because it's all about the fundamental glue of society. Being able to trust those in power is critically important to me. Whether or not I agree with them is less important in a way. But if I get the sense that they're saying things that are untrue, and more to the point that they know to be untrue, and they deliberately do so, then I find that incredibly destabilizing. You just have no idea then where you're landing when you're involved in that kind of conversation, whether it's direct or mediated through the media. Some years ago, I was having a conversation around this topic with a friend of mine, and she said to me, when did it become acceptable to lie in public office and expect to get away with it? And after a bit of thought, I had to say that I think it started with the Iraq War, because at that point we knew they were lying, they knew they were lying, and they still went ahead. And that was to me an incredibly disappointing moment, because of course it was well, not of course, but as it happens, it was a government I would have been prepared to support had it not been for those lies. And so it was kind of being shot by your own side, which made it worse. And in a way, that for me was the starting gun for the demolition of democracy in this country. Another aspect of it is the use and abuse of statistics. This has been a hobby horse of mine for a long time. I studied statistics for a while, and so kind of understand how that goes. But essentially, it's by comparing apples and pears, or apples and oranges, or whatever fruit you like to choose, by using a percentage and an absolute number and putting them in the same sentence and pretending that they say something significant. And in the end, you're none the wiser, because the numbers don't really hang together. And it's one of the things that the media use, and it's a thing that politicians use in interviews in the media, and they sound competent, but they're not. And I think that's another really important issue that needs to be addressed. But I think at bottom, this is about trust. This is about being able to have a conversation with people where you feel on solid ground, whether or not you agree with each other, so that you can move forward. Because if you're not on that solid ground, there is nowhere to go. And I think it undermines the very foundations of democracy as we know it.
Mm. Well, some pretty powerful feelings there from Martina. Gerald, how do you feel when you're in that position? Oh, you'll need to put your microphone on, sorry.
You'd have thought I'd have learnt by now, wouldn't you? I do apologise. I was saying that I came across this piece today in The Guardian. It struck me very powerfully. It's a short piece. I'd just like to read it because it gets to the heart of how I feel. It's by Camilla Shamsi, and she's writing from the perspective of someone who grew up in Pakistan during the despots moved to democracy and back to despots again. And she wrote, "I looked with envy at older democracies, and particularly at the UK, which once had a version of dictatorship, monarchy, and had evolved over centuries into a democracy so unshakable it didn't even require a constitution to underpin it. In such a system, institutions such as the judiciary and parliament were sacrosanct. And while there might be individual cases of corruption, there was a system of checks and balances, a culture of expectation and precedent that meant such behaviour couldn't be flagrant and, if found out, would not be forgiven." That's the image of my country that I grew up with. That's what I absorbed into my very bones. I'm very proud of being British. So what I see, and it's so blatant that we can't trust people in power. You ask what I feel deep anger. I feel shame, because however marginally I'm participant in this, and I feel embarrassment. I was in at a Singapore food stall some time ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, with my son, and we were buying food, and someone stood by us and was talking about the quality of this particular food stall. I'm very proud of her daughter, who worked for one of the big accounting firms. And suddenly said, and what about Brexit? And giggled. My country was no longer somewhere that people looked up to. It was somewhere to laugh at. I feel anger because we can be so much better. And it's not just the behaviour of individuals. Camilla talked about a constitution not requiring, it was so good, how did she say it? A democracy so unshakable, it didn't even require a constitution to underpin it. Peter Hennessy, the historian and constitutionalist, talks about a constitution of good chaps, and chapesses implied, that people have a sense of integrity and will know the boundaries of the system and not overstep those internal as boundaries, because they're not external, they're internalised. The worrying thing for me, picking up a theme that Martina started, is the way that current politicians are undermining the architecture of checks and responsibility and accountabilities that our democracy has already. So the Electoral Commission now comes under the guidance of a government minister. The own Patterson affair sought to rewrite the rules actually in situ that govern an MP's behaviour. The headline, the enemies of the people, the infamous headline, enemies of the people, about our judiciary, which was not incidentally met with anything like a decent, robust response by the then Minister of Justice, who happened to be called Liz Truss, who has so far not indicated she's going to appoint an ethics advisor. So the situation has not been good, and I don't look with any optimism to the future, actually.
If I can pick up,
That's how I feel.
Thank you, Gerald. I mean, I was interested where you said you felt proud to be British. I mean, I certainly don't anymore feel proud to be British. I feel ashamed. That's a real transition in my lifetime. And in your essay, you talk about this visible decline in standards. Would you like to talk a bit more about that?
One of the things I did in response to the situation was to think that I really needed to step outside my comfort zone. Incidentally, I said what I really meant was I used to be proud of being British. I used to be proud. As a child, I was emotionally proud. As a young man, and until really quite recently, I was proud of what we seem to exemplify at many levels. Of course, there are issues in our history that we can't be proud of. Of course there are. But there was something there that I felt we could stand for, and I no longer feel that to be the case. But decline in standards, I was saying that I decided to get out of my comfort zone, and I started subscribing to a range of newspapers. I live about 60 miles from the Irish coast, so I subscribed to the Irish Times. Much as I did not want to put money into the pockets of Rupert Murdoch, I started subscribing to the Times and the Financial Times, because in a conversation with Geoffrey Hoskin, the historian, he talked about the Guardian being a paper of record for the left and the Financial Times being one for the right. And it seemed appropriate for me to try and find some balance. And so reading articles in the Times particularly, if you look at the comments that come below the line, on a number of articles, the same theme was exemplified by one or two people that, of course, all politicians lie. They just do. And mentioned Eden as lied to Parliament at the time of Suez. I don't believe that all politicians lie, and I don't accept the one incident that was quoted against a whole cataclysm of lies that poured out from Downing Street and the government in general until recently. I do believe there's been a decline. In my lifetime, John Profumo resigned and spent the rest of his life working on charitable causes. Peter, then Lord Carrington, resigned as Foreign Office Minister, Secretary of State, because he hadn't seen the invasion of the Falklands by Argentina. These were decent, honourable men who did the decent, honourable thing. You can't imagine anything like that happening now. So that's been the decline. In terms of truth, well, I'll just reiterate what Martina said. Truth is the essential glue that knits us together. Geoffrey Hoskin, again, puts it very well in his book on Russia. In Russian society under Stalin, trust and truth simply collapsed, and the whole of society fell apart. And incidentally, if we're not too proud to learn from difficult situations, there was a superb article in the Financial Times about the difference between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. and why the Ukrainians are having enormous success despite their smaller forces and so on. And the writer ascribed one really powerful added bonus was that Ukrainians had very, very high morale. Why did they have high morale? Because there was explicit and implicit trust throughout the system. The field officers were given command to make decisions. They reported information back. They were trusted to get on with the job. The civilians had a role. They often crowdsourced to buy particular bits of kit for particular units. So night vision glasses for particular units that they knew and particular soldiers. So the soldiers knew they were being reinforced by the civilians behind. This trust flowed through the system, and huge morale as a consequence. Trust and truth are bound together and bind society together. And if we start unpicking truth, then we undermine the trust that we all need to function well as a society. I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but that's as far as I can go now.
Thank you, Gerald. Well, perhaps Jan would like to add to that.
I think the one thing I would say is that I feel all is not lost. There has been a dramatic decline in standards, and Martina is right. That goes back some way to one particular issue. What's happened recently is that we've had deception, lies masquerading across the board. That was an abrupt change, and I think one reason that the Quaker Truth and Integrity Group is in being now is that we still have some faith that this situation can be turned around. Otherwise it would be a council of despair. And I think that most politicians are honourable and decent, and that we can appeal to them on the basis of kinder ground, as put forward in the Swarthmore lecture. And this is what we have to work towards. Certainly expose untruths, deception, but more, I think our emphasis is on promoting cooperation, understanding, reconciliation, listening. As I say, all is not lost, and I think that that is, for me, highly important and key to why I'm in QTIG.
Thank you, Jan. And I know you were wanting to talk about the Nolan principles and Ruth Cadbury.
Yes, well, on the 7th of this month, there was a Westminster Hall debate, which I think is not the same thing as a debate in the House of Commons, on the 7 principles of public life, which are the Nolan principles that most people probably are familiar with. And this was introduced by a Labour member of Parliament. I've been through the 23 odd pages of the debate, which ran for an hour and a half, and I thought it was of an exceptionally high standard. What was really sad and shocking and disconcerting was to find that the government was represented solely by a minister and her private parliamentary secretary. There were no backbenchers whatsoever there. I've written to my MP, who's a Conservative, to ask why that should have been so, and I haven't heard back yet. And it was a time of great turmoil with the change in leadership of the Conservative Party Prime Minister. But it surely tells us something, that there is either an organized resistance to engaging with this issue or a disdain for it. And that is worrying, deeply worrying. And I think some of the people of greatest rectitude in the Conservative Party were booted out, which is a great concern. But again, I don't think that all is lost there. And we hope to engage with people across the spectrum through webinars, for example, in an effort to do what we can to bring truth and integrity back to center stage in the public discourse.
You're muted, Jill.
Thank you, Jan, for that. Olivia, you're going to do the next question.
Oh, let me just unmute myself. So the next question is, what influences, and this is for all three of you really, what influences your decision to trust or not trust what you read in the press, on social media, or hear in political debate, much as Jan was just referring to? Should we go with Martina first, and then maybe Jan?
Okay, fine by me. In a way, that follows on from what I said earlier on, of course. But my first question when I read something or I hear something is, who's saying this? And are they trustworthy? And I have to say that, I mean, I agree that not all politicians lie, but I take quite a lot of what any of them say with a pinch of salt, with maybe the exception of a very small handful of them who I would trust. And so, you know, it's always a question for me is, who is telling me this? Why are they telling me this? What do they want me to either do or think or not do or not think as a result of hearing or reading what they're saying? Who is benefiting from the message? Who's making money out of it? Who's gaining popularity or status or celebrity or whatever out of it? And I mean, it's incredibly difficult to do that, of course, because a lot of these factors are actually quite well hidden. You know, even in the New Statesman, which I read relatively regularly, you get advertising features where messages that appear on the face of it to be reporting are actually advertorials for the people who paid for them. And they're deliberately couched in those terms so that we think of it as news when it isn't. It's incredibly easy to fall foul of the rigorous approach to questioning the background of anything that you hear. I've reposted stuff on Facebook myself, which came from a source that I personally would have thought trustworthy, not a politician, who I knew to be knowledgeable in the field in which the post sat. And then it turned out it wasn't true. It has to be said, the person who posted it, from whom I got it, actually acknowledged this once she found out, which was a nice gesture. And so it allowed her and me and other people to rectify our posts. But it does happen, and you don't always know, and you don't always know how to know whether something is true. I find myself more often than not responding to things that I see on social media by saying, where's the evidence? Is there a reference? Where did you get this from? Because often stuff isn't true. And people react quite badly to it a lot of the time because they think I don't trust them. Well, I don't. That's the point. So it's just being watchful all the time and asking those questions and being aware of those questions and recognizing that if something sounds unlikely, it's likely not to be true.
I think the situation has become much more difficult, largely because of social media. This is a new element, and we've seen it at work, especially in the United States, where there's been a huge polarization of views and people at either end of the political spectrum are having their extreme views reinforced by social media, which says what they want to hear. So they get locked into that way of thinking. And getting around that problem, I think, is enormously difficult. This is the new age we live in and grapple with. And partly, I think we're getting this polarization because our world has become so insecure, so uncertain. So people go for certainty in the form of hearing opinions that they agree with, even if these are sometimes outrageous and one would have thought patently lacking in truth. We saw that in the United States, which has now resiled a little bit from that, but the divisions are still terrifying. And we then saw that jump the Atlantic here in the form of the Brexit debate. One thing I do to try and decide whether to trust what I read or hear is through my membership of QTIG. That I would like to think that here's a body of people who are seriously interested in the issues, are pretty well informed, and come from a similar position that I do. And I hope I'm not being guilty of exactly what I've described in the United States and here, that we hear opinions we want to. But I must say that I've found the contributions made on our QTIG Google group very illuminating. And it's turning into one of my my main monitors of the current situation. And I hope that more people will take advantage of that and join in. And just to say that I think QTIG offers an outlet for us to do something in a way that is very hard to do as an individual. Many of us have written to our MP and had little joy from doing so. But here's an organization that is now sending letters to commend people who have acted particularly honorably, an organization that is in the process of issuing a declaration as to where we stand on truth and integrity in public affairs. And we are thinking of instituting a Truth Award, a National Truth Award, again, to mark those people who have stood up in a particularly notable way. And the letter writing to people to commend what they've done is something we'd be much more active in doing if more people were coming forward to do it. But we're a small nascent organization, and I hope that a gathering like this will lead to other people coming forward, because the opportunity is there to contribute something without taking up an undue amount of time and effort, and in turn generating a sense of solidarity and a sense of purpose.
Thank you very much, Jan. And perhaps one of you could put a link in for Quaker Truth and Integrity Group so people can find it either with a website, or I don't know, if you could put something in the chat space, that would be lovely. Thank you to the friends who are putting questions in the Q&A space. If I take the first one from Diana and John Lampen, what connections do you see between mendacity in advertising, celebrity culture, business reporting, the press, and in politics? Which one of you would like to respond to that?
We haven't really covered so far why it is that Quakers should value democracy. And I think it's linked to this question as well. So I'll see if I can adequately try and cover that. But on our website, by the way, there's a link to a conference we held in April. And the conference was recorded, and the first speaker on the first session whose second I can't remember, Ben Wood, yes, thank you. Ben Wood gave a brilliant talk, about 15 minutes, on Quakers, the history of Quakers and our connection with democracy. But put simply, we're all equal. And why do we see ourselves as all equal? Because deep in the DNA of Quakers is a sense that anyone, and you can say this in different ways, but any one individual is a child of God. Any one individual is a portal to divine wisdom. Any one individual can give voice to the truths of the Spirit. And we might not know what the kingdom of heaven looks like in political terms, but what we do know is that the system of government which nurtures individual conscience, which accepts individual conscience, sometimes with a great deal of effort. A great deal of people have to work hard and sometimes suffer to make democracy advance forward. But liberal democracy is the system of government that most effectively allows individuals and the individual voices to be heard. Going back to the question, isn't it around in which there's a lot of lack of truth in the world? Well, a friend of mine reminded me that if we look back and read our Bible, for those of us who are familiar, and I'm not terribly familiar, what was it the prophets were denouncing? They were denouncing injustice and untruth in the world around them. There's nothing new in this sense that the world is a challenging place to live. It's a challenging place to live for people of and with integrity. The early Quakers, Ben Pink-Dandelion has a superb set of diagrams about the relationship of Quakers and the world, and at different times in their history. And it started off with Quakers as a kind of elect group, and then the world was outside, and gradually we've got closer to the world. But that shouldn't blind us to the fact that while Quakers are in the world, we're not of the world. Our values, our standpoint, the things that we stand on are fundamentally different. We may have people in common. We may share those things we stand on with others, but the world of itself is a challenging place. And I accept the impetus of the question. It's a shame we can't hear from the Lampards, because I love their take on this question themselves. But yes, if we look at all those things they cited, celebrity culture and social media and politicians, it is the world. And that's what we hear. And I want to pick up Jan's point about not all is lost. We are here to transform the world. That's our job. We transform ourselves as Quakers in order that the world is transformed. And by example and by reconciliation and by prophetic denunciation, we hope that to touch that world that has been around for a lot longer than we have.
I think in response to the question, I would like to add a few things to what Gerald has said. I think one of the issues here is the fantastical wealth that comes with celebrity and power, and the extraordinary and extreme inequality that our society represents. the UK is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And we pay a high price for that, because the people who have the power and the money, and have the money or the power because they have the money, cling on to it for dear life. And on one level, you know, on a kind of individual personal level, you can quite understand that, because they've got used to a standard of living that the rest of us can only imagine, or not, as the case may be. And they see that other people don't live like that and they don't want to lose it. So yeah, I get that. But it doesn't actually help society. There's a very good book which formed the basis of a Salter lecture, I think in 2009, if I remember correctly, called The Spirit Level, which actually outlines in meticulous scientific detail, using numbers correctly and appropriately, I may say, that shows how inequality erodes social cohesion, and how in country after country, the higher the inequality, the worse the social outcomes for all, not just for the poor, but for all. And I think it's another area where we need to kind of come back to our senses. When you look at the kind of money that performers and sports people and so on get paid, it just distorts the world we live in a way that then opens up the floodgates for people clinging on to power with lies and whatever else it takes.
Thank you.
We have a couple of other questions in the chat as well. So one from Alistair is asking, what sources do you recommend for fact checking?
I think from my point of view, the best way of fact checking is to look at the same story in from different perspectives. So, I mean, Gerald's very wonderful example of reading all these different papers is exactly what we need to be doing. I probably don't do anything like enough of it, because I don't seem to have the time to read so many papers. I did for a while read the Daily Telegraph on a daily basis online, so I didn't have to pay for it. Then they charged for it and I stopped. But it was like 2 years of putting myself at the receiving end of a level of hostility that I've never seen before, because every time I commented, I got an avalanche of abuse from other people. And just looking at it from different perspectives, there was a picture at some point during the Iraq War when they pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein in the center of Baghdad. On the news in this country, the images of that were of a crowded space full of people cheering and showing how the population of Iraq were all in favor of the pursuit of the Western agenda. And on the same night, I then switched over to German news, which at the time I could do because I was living in Brussels. It's much harder here. And they were showing exactly the same piece of film, but taken from a place further away from the center of action. And you could see that the square was almost empty. And quite a lot of the people were in uniform of the Western allies. And so you were seeing the same kind of pictures, but it gave you a completely different idea of what was being said. And so the best way of judging whether something is potentially likely to be true is to see it through the lens of other people. So, you know, looking at Al Jazeera from time to time, looking at papers in Ireland or other countries where we happen to be able to read them, is a way of doing that. I wouldn't recommend Russia Today, I have to say, because they have their own agenda, and an agenda we sort of know what it is. And just because they don't trust us doesn't mean I have to trust them.
I think in the face of the mendacity to which we've been exposed, particularly in recent years, a whole plethora of organizations has sprung up like mushrooms, of which we are one. And a lot of these pump material out all the time, more than I can keep up with. But I think there's some very useful stuff there, and it seems to come to you almost automatically. You don't have to dig very deep to get hold of it. So I think that is a genuinely useful source, but again, one needs to be discriminating.
Thank you. We've got another question in the Q&A, and friends, do please feel free to add more, because we have another 14 minutes left, so we can take a couple more questions, so type them in the Q&A. This question is from Meg Hill. Do panelists think that not feeling the need to be truthful in public life is related to our living in a more secular society? Who'd like to respond to that one?
Well, I'll do it, putting my head firmly on the block. I don't think so, because I think that the assumption behind this would be that the representatives of the non-secular world are more truthful than anybody else. And I think different faiths and different churches within the Christian faith have demonstrated excessively that they can tell untruths and do harmful things and support monstrous governments and inequality in large measure. Some of the things that representatives of these churches and faiths have done to people are unspeakable as have been done by others. And so I don't think that it's a safeguard against untruth or inequality or any of the other things that we're concerned about.
I tend to think very slowly, so perhaps I could pick up a point that Jan made about organisations springing up to try and defend democracy or work towards more democratic structures, and of which there are numerous. One of the things we're doing on QTIG is talking to secular organisations in this space, and we're also getting enormous amount of support from Britain Yearly Meeting, and they're giving us a lot of advice. And one of the things that we've been told is that we're joining. If we launch into the secular, if we launch into defending democracy, it's a very crowded space. So what is it that we uniquely offer? But if we try and work with the values that are underpinning democracy, then that is not a crowded space. There are very few organisations around that. I don't think that answers Meg Hill's question, but I wanted to make that simple point.
I think it's a very good question, and I wish I'd thought about it more beforehand. caught rather on the hop by it. I think that when this country was predominantly Christian and a large proportion of the population went to church regularly, there was a sort of binding set of values which we don't quite have now. I think those values popped up again, curiously enough, upon the death of the Queen. I remember the BBC started asking some of the people in the queue why they were there and probed a little deeper to find out what it was that had brought them there. And the types of replies that were coming through sounded very familiar in terms of what we're about. People were talking about truth and integrity and decency and constancy. So that those values are still there, I think, at among many ordinary people. In terms of what we can bring to this, trying to build on what Gerald said, what's the unique thing that we can do? There are a number of other faith groups who are also deeply concerned about this issue, but I think it's harder for them to connect with the secular world than it is for us, because they're generally more doctrinal. They come from a very distinct vantage point. Whereas I think what we're saying is that our concern about truth and integrity is based on truth with a capital T, something indefinable, and yet something we feel and know and are guided by, friends of the truth. And I think that approach has traction in the secular world. I'm often struck by people I know who declare themselves to be atheists or humanists by the strong set of ethical values they have. Where does that come from? And I think there is common ground there, and it's to that we need to appeal. So not from the specific Christian context that we had in the past, to whatever extent that may have bound us together, but from something deeper, and that feeds into our response to climate change as well. I think unless we're coming from some position of deep identification with the world around us, deep respect for and reverence for the world around us, we're not going to get there. I think it's as stark as that there will have to be a return to spiritual values at every level of society if we are to cope with the massive problems that lie ahead of us. Otherwise, we'll continue to do much as we are now, react too late, and in terms of vested interests, I'm thinking of that excellent BBC series, television series, Big Oil, which showed how the big oil companies pulled the wool over our eyes for decades, knowing full well the impact of burning fossil fuels on CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And they were aided and abetted by the government. They were able to influence the government on a massive scale. And it's very hard to turn that particular supertanker around unless, I think, we approach the world from a fundamentally different place.
That fits in very well with a book by Tom Holland, I think, with a book by Tom Holland called Dominion, which is quite a tome. You don't have to read the tome because he's given various podcasts, various TV interviews about the central thesis of his book. And he starts the book by talking in very personal terms about his childhood, brought up in an Anglican home. I think his father was a vicar. And then being told at Sunday school at something the age of 8 that Adam and Eve and dinosaurs existed at the same time. And he knew that was a load of nonsense. So he dropped Christianity altogether. And then went on to study the classical world. And no matter that he's an expert in the classical world, he never felt entirely at home. It's a very cruel, empty world. And in reflecting on that, he realised that actually the world he was at home in is the world that we've got, in which human life is seen to be sacred. And where does that come from? And he says, and I think argues very convincingly, that it's that religion that started with the man on a cross that made such a difference in the world, in the Western world, that we wouldn't have things like Black Lives Matter. We wouldn't have Me Too. We wouldn't have all the powerful so-called secular movements which have done so much to change the way we view the world, unless we had that fundamental rooting in the Christian idea that all lives are important. And it's tapping into that sense, like Jan says, that sense in which we all have something in common. And it's deeply spiritual. We are not just economic human beings, not just political human beings, but we are spiritual people. And it's tapping into that world of the spirit in a way that does not put people off with blockages of language and so on.
Thank you. I wonder now that we have just 3 minutes left, if each of you would like 1 minute on suggestions for friends of things that they could do. And it may be by your own example of something you've done or ideas that QTIG are putting out there. QTIG is Quaker Truth and Integrity Group. And if you put quakertruth.org in your search bar, you will go to their page, their web page. But if each of you has perhaps 1 minute saying suggestions of something that friends could do, people have been motivated to turn up this evening, what is it you suggest they do next?
Join QTIG.
Thank you, Jan.
Join QTIG because there are plenty of different things that people can do. All talents would be welcome. It's purposeful. We're getting off the ground. We very much need more people. As I've said before, the letter writing group, which I think could be really influential, needs people to write letters, and that can be done both as part of a central QTIG body or in local meetings or area meetings. And I hope that that will come about, a bit like Amnesty International gets people to get together to write letters. If the Truth Award takes off, we'll need a committee for that, which I hope would be drawn from all parts of the country. So there would be scope there for people to take part. Have a look at the website. Join QTIG and come along to our plenary meetings. The next one is tomorrow night.
Thank you. Martina.
I'll follow up directly from that, because I was going to say most of the same things that Jan has just said. But adding to that, I think the letter writing thing depends on a large number of friends monitoring what politicians out there are doing and saying, because the very few people who are active in QTIG at the moment on these issues cannot possibly monitor all of it. So if we had 1 or 2 people in every meeting around the country who were actually paying attention to what their MPs are doing and their other elected representatives, and alerting QTIG letter writing group to examples of particularly positive, truthful behavior that signaled integrity, then the group would have a much better basis on which to write these letters. So I think that would be something that we could share right across the yearly meeting.
Thank you. And Gerald?
We talk a lot about writing to MPs. Finding something that you can write to someone that is particularly stands out. I wrote to Munira Mirza when she resigned after Boris Johnson made the slur about Jimmy Savile and Keir Starmer, and I recognised that it was a very difficult decision for her. Munira Mirza was Boris Johnson's, as it were, right-hand person. She'd worked with him as Mayor of London. She was very close to him. And I acknowledged just what a difficult decision it must have been, and what a great testimony it was to her truth and her integrity. And she wrote back, and it's a handwritten letter, and I've shown it before at a conference. It's very simple. I keep it by my desk. Dear Mr. Hewitson, many thanks for your kind letter, dated 23rd of Feb, and apologise for taking so long to respond. It was, as you say, a difficult decision, and I appreciated your words. And Munira Mirza and I, if we went for a drink on the many bars on the Thames, would not have a thing in common to talk about. I'm so opposed to everything she stands for politically, but that action of hers stood out as very decent, fundamentally really strong and decent. And just recognising that, I think people appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all three of you, for all the stimulation you've given us tonight, both in terms of what we do and think about ethically, but also what we can think and do practically. It's a both-and option, isn't it, to witness, worship, and be out there as witnesses. Carol's raised her hand. Carol, if you have something, pop it in the chat space and I'll have a quick look. But otherwise, I'd like to say thank you very much for the panel tonight. The next edition of Friends Quarterly will be out in November, and we're looking at the environment again, particularly linked to COP27 meeting in Egypt. So there'll be 4 articles on that theme, and you can subscribe via the Friend if you get that. So yeah, thank you, Martina. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Gerald.